Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Listen and Grow podcast. I'm your host, Zach Randles-Friedman. This podcast sounds a little different today because I'm not in my home studio. I'm doing this remotely from a hotel room. So if you're seeing this video or the sound quality isn't as good, I apologize, but I'll be back home in a few days and with better quality podcast. But let's get into today's episode because it's a little heavier. Because today we're not just talking about headlines, we're talking about what those headlines actually mean. What happens when visibility, when progress, when simply existing as who you are, starts to meet resistance? And I think a lot of us can feel that tension right now. Because on one hand, we're seeing more representation, more acknowledgement, more visibility than ever before. And on the other hand, we're seeing pushback, legal, cultural, personal. And sometimes it's subtle. And sometimes it's not. So let's get into it. Our first story is fake CNN incident is fully expanded. I want to start with a story that's honestly very unsettling because it blurs a line that should feel very clear. A same-sex couple in Los Angeles, Anthony Volin and David Miller Robinson, say they were approached while walking home with their newborn. Now, imagine this for a second. You're just walking home with your baby and you're in a normal everyday life. And suddenly a group of people approach you with a camera and a microphone claiming to be from CNN. So immediately, there's a level of perceived legitimacy. It feels official. And it feels like maybe you're being asked to share something positive. But according to the couple, that tone shifted quickly. The question became less about their baby and more about them being a same-sex couple raising a child. And that's where things start to feel uncomfortable. Because it's not curiosity, it's scrutiny. And this underlying question of, should you be even doing this? And then it escalated. Now there are conflicting reports about exactly what happened physically. One of the men is now facing a felony vandalism charge. So legally, this is still unfolding. But what's really important here is that the pattern of people are reacting to it. Because within days, the LGBTQ plus community rallied. A fundraiser for the couple raised over $100,000. And that kind of response doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because people recognize something deeper. This isn't just one of those awkward encounters. It's a part of a broader moment where LGBTQ plus families are being questioned more openly, more aggressive, and sometimes in ways that feel staged or targeted. And that's what makes this story stick. Because it takes something as simple as walking home with your child and it turns into a moment where your identity is put on trial. So I think it's amazing that the LGBTQ plus people in the community are supporting this person with a GoFundMe account. Next, trans prison ruling fully expanded. So let's talk about something that's very real, and that has very serious consequences. A federal appeals court has lifted protections that were preventing trans women in federal custody from being transferred to men's prison. And I want to slow this down for a second because this is easy to hear something like and think, okay, legal decision, policy change. But this is not abstract. This is where people live, where they sleep, where they are most vulnerable. This ruling is tied to a broader policy direction that says inmates should be housed based on their sex assigned at birth. And on the surface, some people argue that this is about consistency or safety, but the reality is very different. Because trans women placed in a men's prison face significantly higher risk of physical violence, sexual assault, harassment, and isolation. And that's not speculation. That's been documented over and over again. So when protections like this is lifted, it's not a policy shift. It's a decision that directly increases risk of a very specific group of people. Now, to be clear, this isn't the end of the legal road. There are still ongoing challenges. Individual cases can still be brought. But this moment, it matters because it signals a direction and it raises a bigger question. Who are these policies actually protecting and who are they putting in harm's way? And this next story is exactly why that question matters. Because we already have real examples of what happens when trans women are back in men's facilities. A transgender inmate in Oregon received a $295,000 settlement after being allegedly abused while housed in a men's prison. And when you hear the details of her experience, it's not something you can just gloss over. She described ongoing harassments from both inmates and staff, being forced into humiliating and degrading situations, being exposed and treated in ways that stripped her of her dignity, and at one point her legal team argued that she was essentially being paraded around in vulnerable states. and a judge eventually recognized her as a vulnerable individual and ordered certain protections, which tells you how serious the situation was. This is what they look like in real life. This is not the era. It's not hypothetical. It's happening. And then we have Laverne Cox, who said something this week that honestly cuts through all of it. She talked about dehumanization, and that's where everything begins. Because once a group of people is no longer seen as fully human, it becomes easier to justify taking away rights, excluding them from spaces, putting them in harm's way. And what she pointed out, which I think is really important, is that a lot of her arguments we're hearing right now, they're not actually about what they claim to be about. They're framed around protecting people, keeping things fair, and ensuring safety. But beneath that framing, there's something else happening. There's a narrative being built, and that narrative creates distance. And once there's distance, it becomes easier for people to look away. Next, we talk about Andy Cohen versus Joe Rogan. So Andy Cohen is stepping in and calling out Joe Rogan. And what stood out for me wasn't about what he said, but how he said it. He didn't soften it. He didn't try to make it more palatable. He said it directly. And honestly, we don't see that from a lot of public figures because there's usually a level of caution, a level of PR filtering. But when misinformation about trans people is being spread at that level on platforms with massive audiences, it has real consequences. It shapes perceptions, it reinforces stereotypes, and it contributes to the kind of environment we're seeing in these other stories. And moments like this, where somebody actually pushes back in real time, they matter because silence doesn't really work anymore. If you haven't watched this, Google it, because Andy Cohen went off on Joe Rogan, dropped the F-bomb and everything, and good for you, Andy. So behind you. The next story feels almost surreal. The FBI reportedly sent a government plane to Cuba as part of a custody dispute involving a trans parent. And I want you to just sit with that for a second, because that's not a typical custody case. This involved a 10-year-old child and disagreements between parents around gender-affirming care. And somehow it escalated to the point of international involvement. And now legal details are complex. There are questions around custody, jurisdiction, and parental rights. But zooming out, the bigger picture here is what stands out. Because when something reaches this level of intervention, it becomes more than a family matter. It becomes complex, it becomes political, and it raises questions about government being involved in personal decisions, how trans parents are treated in custody disputes, and what rights families actually have. And that's where it starts to feel bigger than just one case. And our next story is there was a loss in the trans community. And this story is heartbreaking. A 74-year-old trans woman in San Francisco was killed in a hit and run. Now, what stood out to me wasn't just because of the incident itself, it's how people talked about her. They described her as kind, generous, eloquent, deep, and caring. And that matters because too often stories about trans people get reduced to headlines. But behind every headline, there's a person, a life, and a community. People who knew them, people who loved them, and now people who are dealing with the loss. And that's something we shouldn't just lose sight of. Next, there's a religious backlash. Now we have ongoing tensions between religion and LGBTQ plus visibility. A major Baptist organization is reconsidering its relationship with Baylor University. And the reason? Students hosted LGBTQ plus speakers. That's it. It shows how something as simple as creating a space for conversation can still be seen as controversial. And we've seen this pattern before, where education, inclusion, and dialogue are framed as threats. And once again, LGBTQ plus visibility becomes the focal point. Then we have a story that honestly doesn't need much commentary. A pastor who publicly campaigned against LGBTQ plus content has now pleaded guilty to sexual offenses involving a minor. And it's one of those moments where the contrast is impossible to ignore, because we've seen this pattern before. Loud opposition, public morale positioning, and then something very different happening behind the scenes. And I'll leave that story there for you. And our final story is a suspect has been charged after an attack of the OpenAI CEO Sam Altman's home. Authorities say it may have been driven by fears around artificial intelligence, and while that story isn't directly tied to LGBTQ issues, it connects something broader: fear. And what happens when fear isn't addressed? Because when fear builds, it doesn't just stay internal, it turns outward. And sometimes it turns into actions. So yes, this episode was a little heavier, but it's all real because alongside visibility, there is resistance. Along progress, there are still very big challenges that are coming. And there is also community, and that means support. If this episode resonated with somebody that you know, please be sure to share it with them. Also, be sure to leave a comment, because when you leave a comment or you leave a review, more people get to see this podcast. And I think it's really important that our community is staying informed about what's happening. I'm your host, Zach Randles-Friedman, and I'll be back tomorrow with more LGBTQ plus news.